Is that better? That's better. Wonderful.
Hello.
We'll sort it out. Can everyone hear down the back? Yes? Beautiful.
Can everybody hear?
Yeah. Of course, John Clarke with Bryan Dawe has been conducting interviews on a range of issues on television for 27 years, longer than I've been born. Every Thursday for 2.5 minutes or 2 3/4 minutes. I've never actually taped it, but I think it's around that.
It varies.
A fresh interview is screened, and as John Clarke says on his own blog site, fired into the blithosphere, which I've never been able to say before, but anyway, I'll put my teeth into that. Of course, in the 70s, he created Fred Dawe with all his sons, Trevor, 7 of them. He co-imagined and co-wrote the games in the late 90s with Ross Stevenson and starred in the series too. John Clarke has written films with Paul Cox as well, and one of them is called Lonely Heart, which is the story of my life. He writes poetry as well. The even more complete book of Australian verse, I think, is on sale here at the back. We'll put on him later on. The books for sale as well. He's written some essays too on his father Ted, his mother Neva, and his friend Paul Cox, which are available on his website under a section called Tinkering, and we're going to go into that again. So could you please welcome to the Twilight School stage poet, performer, essayist, screenwriter, and much, much more, Mr. John Clarke. John, you like my notes? I went to
It'll never fly, Bruce.
John, what do you think of the shack here at his
It's good, isn't it? Yeah. Bruno said to me, in giving me directions to come up here, try not to be on the road between 4 and 5:30. So I came up a bit earlier in the afternoon and went to a beautiful place called Jellybrand Park, which is full of pardos. Which was a lovely afternoon, and it's great to then turn up here and be welcomed by an official party of Corrals.
That's 7 million already. Put more than the Rangers ready for you too. John turned up, it was so early that I thought he was the maintenance man. Checked with everything kind of ready too. So deep apologies for that, because I didn't gush the way I should. John, it's been a couple of years, but we've had a conversation or two before. You and Bryan Dawe came out to the university a few times, and so I feel I know you just a little bit. So thanks for coming out. I know that my badges you to death. As I said, we're pretty impressed with the Clarke Mansion. We named it after you in honour of you coming out.
It's fantastic, yeah.
John, on a sincere note, when I wrote you and said, please come out, you're probably expecting a little letter about 3 days out going, John, we're going to cover these territories and we'll talk about these things and I'd like to investigate these things. But I told you nothing of that, and I saw that as an enormous sign of trust, so thank you for that too.
That's all right. I'm quite happy to talk in order to find out what I think.
On a serious note, you're used to scripting your things and you're organised and you've got people around you who all know their roles, and suddenly a short little Italian man says, come out and just trust me and we'll go into all sorts of places. Does that surrendering of that little bit of control, is that a bit unnerving?
No, I don't think that's fun. It's just like a conversation.
Yeah. When I told you the summary was past the kind of airport and that there was a road that led there, you kind of didn't seem to quite believe me that there would be a road at the end of the freeway which you added to summary. Yeah.
I did. It's just that I haven't been to this particular place before.
How did the storytelling, performing, creative gene kind of get into you?
Well, I think it probably came from way before me, but I don't know quite what ways. My parents are both quite good storytellers. They're both interested in entertaining, and they're quite socially interesting. And they came from quite different backgrounds, and because they left school in the Depression and then went to the Second World War, they met in the Second World War in Italy. They were both in the New Zealand Army. But because they'd left school before getting anything other than a pretty basic education, it was my generation was the first one that went to a university. And when I got to the university, I was confronted with a huge range of different things I could study. I had a pretty terrible secondary schooling, so when I went to university, I thought I'd studied things that nobody else could have studied at secondary school, and so I wouldn't be at a disadvantage. So I started studying law and arts, and I then went did some economics as well. But I majored in English, and it was English that particularly interested me. And in my second year, I think, I sort of, by accident almost, got involved in the annual stage show that was at the university. And I walked on stage and thought, this is where the plug goes in the wall for me. And I then realised that if I wanted to perform, and a lot of people in my field begin as a performer, and I worked out that if I wanted to perform, I wasn't going to get a lot of work if I waited for the phone to ring and somebody asking me to play Hamlet. I thought that's not going to happen. So I'd better write stuff for me to say. So I would think stuff up. I didn't used to write it down, I just used to think it up and remember it and then say it on stage. And eventually, if you're going to involve other people in what you're writing, you need to write their lines. So you become a writer. And that had happened by about third year of university. And it was very difficult to make a living in New Zealand at the time. And so my question for the next few years was, I know exactly what I want to do, how do I make a living doing it? And that wasn't an easy question to answer, because a lot of the things where the money is in this line of work aren't the things you want to do. And a lot of things you do want to do, there's no money. So part of it is a compromise, part of it is strategizing, doing that thing there which will pay you enough money to finish doing this thing over here that you're the real point, and so on. And I've lived, since that time, I've lived partly in television and partly occasionally in film, and occasionally in radio, and occasionally on the stage, and sometimes in print. And I've been lucky. I've been lucky in all sorts of ways in my life. The one way in which I've been lucky is that because I have always written material that comes out of my own response to the world, I have got more interested in my writing as I've got older, because it's about more. It's about what I'm thinking, and what I'm thinking is now got a greater provenance and concerns a longer history and concerns other memories and things. I mean, the thing that Bruno mentioned on I've got a website, and there's a section on it called Tinkering, where I just put things that I've written, which I don't have any other particular outlet for. And those things are just the things that by and large, they're things that keep coming back to me, a story that it just won't go away in my head or something or other, or when my mother died and then my father died, I wrote a kind of eulogy, but over time, over the ensuing few months, other memories of them and little stories and impressions and feelings would come back to me and nestle in around the eulogy. So I opened it all up, opened the document up, and I just let it expand until it contained most of those, and then I tried to give it a little bit of a form and put it up. I don't know who's interested in things like that. I have no idea. Nobody pays me to do those things, but I subsidise that. I think about that, and I would like to do it properly.
Is that you, John, also trying, in the later stages of your life, trying to get a better understanding of your own parents too? Is that...
Yes, although I'm not in the latter stages. I'm rather hoping
Yes, you are.
Beautifully too, and I apologise for that. But in a sense, I got the sense when Looney talked about the passing of his father, I got the sense that he felt that he understood his father a bit better from after death. I gave the eulogy for my father who was 90, and I think in that moment of giving the eulogy, I think I understand him better than I had through the previous 55 years too. I'm just wondering if was the writing of your father and your mother in some sense an attempt to get a clearer kind of sense of them and to appreciate them more and to understand their influence on you too?
No, I don't think it was really, because I think I gave the eulogy in each case with my parents, and I think that in each case, my first concern was to do what they would want me to have done, to make the occasion work, get the job done, as well as possible, and tell some stories to people who were there, who knew lots of stories, but not everyone knew all the stories. So to be a bit of a funnel for all of that and to somehow synthesise a lot of things that were in play on those days. When I expanded them a little bit, I wrote a bit more about things from my perspective. And if I opened them up again, I would do that in a big way, I think, because there are all sorts of things that aren't in the eulogies, and because it's not time for those things, perhaps, or something. But in terms of my relationship with my parents split up, and their marriage wasn't very successful from quite early on. So, and if that happens to you, one of the things you do is that you sort of separate yourself from them in a way as a unit, and you have two separate relationships with them. Well, that was the case with me, and they're each valuable, and there are all sorts of ironies in it. My mother, for example, was an actor and a writer. She wrote stories and novels and all sorts of things. And my father would never have read any of them. He never saw her on a stage. He never saw me on a stage.
Did that hurt?
No.
This question.
Well, put it this way, it didn't hurt me. And when I performed, and my mother was always very supportive of her children. She encouraged them to do things. She was a great you can do this person. And my father would have thought I was completely incompetent and would never be able to do anything. And the last thing he would have wanted me to do is what I've done with my life. The irony is that the way I do it is exactly like my father. It's not like my mother at all. I used to watch my mother on stage, and her sort of acting isn't really what I ever had any impulse for. My father, though, who wouldn't do it, he just, there's something in him that wouldn't let it happen. So as to the genetic question, I think you need it all over the place. It's a recessive gene and it needs to come from everywhere.
You start both the pieces of your mum and your dad with kind of by looking at a photograph. Is that a good technique for people who are trying to get a way into a story about someone who's significant, to say, well, grab a photograph of a moment and build it from there? Was that a useful kind of way in for you?
Well, it was. I don't know. I got a lot of people wrote to me after those two things appeared and said that they had thought of doing something about their parent or grandparent or uncle friend or whatever it was. And I wrote back to these people and encouraged them to do it. And but I didn't want to be prescriptive. I didn't want to say, this is how you do it, because I don't know how you do it. I mean, that's just my current version of what I've done. And it can be changed. But I did say to them, there is not a recipe. It's not, there's not, here are the plans, this is how you do it. But a good way to start is that not only should you do it, but if you write from your own particular perspective, you're the only person who can do it.
Yes.
by definition. And if you don't like it, you don't have to show it to anybody. And I write plenty of stuff that I don't show to anybody because I just don't, that's not quite, I start off doing something and it becomes something else. There's a famous James Thurber drawing of somebody arriving at a house and behind the people arriving at the house is a bookcase. And the man says, welcome, come in, this is my wife. And that up there is the first Mrs. Frobisher. And it's a famous cartoon. And he was asked how he did it, and he said, actually, I started off trying to draw a staircase. The staircase didn't work, so I turned it into a bookshelf. And then I had to make use of the bookshelf, so I put something on it. And then I had to make up a line that made the drawing work. So a lot of the sort of work you end up doing in any creative enterprise is a little bit like that. It grows in all sorts of directions. It's like talk. Talk is a first draft of all sorts of things. A lot of writing, for example, reminds me of the sort of thing that you used to think when you were... If you have the experience, which we probably all had as kids, of being in some particular situation and being deeply uncomfortable or humiliated or unhappy or completely sort of unhorsed by what was going on. And as you walk away, or perhaps even a day later, you think of what you should have said. Writing is that.
Yes.
Writing is what you should have said. You can create a particular little world. I suppose in the case of my parents, I'm trying to get a kind of authorised version of each of them with which I'm happy, and with which I think they would be happy. I'd like them to be happy because although there were difficulties,
I think they would smile approvingly down on the pieces that you've written about them.
I hope so.
You quote Seamus Heaney, and I know you love poetry too, John, in the piece about your mother, and it says, in a life the nucleus stays the same, but with any luck the circumference moves out. Tell us what you mean. Why did you...
Well, she came from a small place, and she was at secondary school when the Depression happened, and she had to leave and get a job, and then the war happened, and the young man she was going to marry went away and was a pilot and was killed. And she just couldn't stand to stay in the little town anymore, so she joined the army, and she joined the Women's Army Corps, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and she volunteered to go overseas, and she went to Italy, which is where the New Zealand Army was by the time she got there in 1944. And the business of even leaving the country was expanding. It was a much bigger world than her mother's world the moment she left the country. Then she got to a war, so what I meant is that, and what Seamus meant, I remember when Seamus said that, he meant that he came from a particular part of Ireland in the north called Derry, and he still writes a lot out of memory, as a lot of Irish writers do. There's a very brilliant documentary on YouTube. YouTube is fantastic. There's a marvellous documentary there about an Irish writer who's about Seamus's age. He wasn't a poet, he was a novelist called John McGarren. He was a wonderful writer. The documentary is called something like A Quiet Place or something, and a lot of it is about memory, about particular memories from a particular place at a particular time, and Seamus is doing all of that. And what he said was that he was the professor of poetry at Harvard University and all that sort of stuff, but when he wrote, he was on the plains of Derry, because that was the rich memory, the place where he learned his language, where he learned 2 languages, the place where his family was, the place where the history that he broke by being a poet was all still running there, the agricultural history. They ran a cattle farm. And what he said was, the nucleus stays the same. In other words, I'm exactly the same person, but I'm not still there. circumference moves out. But it resonated in his case, and I think in a lot of cases, against the memories that we all have from wherever we got them. And I think a lot of the memories, I can remember things that I have never seen, that my parents told me, for example. I know who lived on the corner of my mother's street in 1930, for example.
What was the name?
Edna Walker. But in other words, and I'm absolutely certain that's true, but there's a river of memory that runs through, that comes to us from all sorts of previous places. And I find that pretty interesting too. Because Seamus and Irish writing generally, but John McGarren is very interesting about this subject. He starts the documentary, for example, by saying, we're getting off the subject, so I'll be quick, but he starts the documentary by saying that he was walking, when he walks down a country lane in Ireland, and he is walking down a country lane with his dog in the picture, as he's talking about this, he says, when I do this, I'm occasionally so calm and secure, and I feel that I'll never die. And he said, this is all to do with the memory I have of walking down a country lane with my mother when I was 3. And when I walked down that lane with my mother when I was 3, I must have been very happy.
Seamus and his dad, of course, was a turf digger, wasn't he? A farmer. And
yeah, well, he was a cattle farmer. They were digging turf for the fire.
And Seamus says that the connection he has with his dad is that he digs with his pen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I'm doing the family's traditional thing.
My father's a peasant farmer too, so yeah. Your last line of your story about your dad quotes him, and he goes, when I go into orbit, I'll go into orbit with a smile on my face. It's not a bad thing to say.
No, he was good.
Yeah?
He
Would you like to borrow that line as your parting kind of line too?
I don't know. I think he was seeking a kind of resolve, and he made a very good job of it actually. But he was an emotionally rather repressed man. He said one of my daughters went to see him about a week before he died, and he said, I rang him up and said, how was that? And he said, it was wonderful. It was just marvellous. Kind of her to come. She's absolutely wonderful. He said, John, it was almost emotional. How repressed is that?
John, there's art and creativity and performing and being a poet and expressing and helping influences. Is that a way of safeguarding yourself against the danger of being repressed too? Is art about making sure that we live in a very alive kind of way?
Well, I think art can be about all sorts of things. And I think a lot of things that aren't officially art are art, and a lot of things that are officially art aren't. I think these terms are a bit woolly, but I do think. I mean, one of the things that did occur to me at university is that the social life and the people I met, who'll probably never know how important they were to me, because I'd never met people like them. They were so brilliant and so generous and open, and the fun we had was completely beguiling, and it had a whole lot of things in it that I have used in my work. Like, it had a rhythm, for example. A lot of things you do as a performer or as a writer, obviously in poetry, but even in, like, Bryan and I will often do an interview, like we did one last week where I was pretending to be in London and he was being here, and we shot it twice. They wanted to do something with the lighting or something or other after the first one, so we shot it again. So we had two versions of it, and I looked at them in editing, and the words are exactly the same, and it was quite clear which one was funnier. It's the rhythm. it's not always the words. There was a scene in the games which we very seldom did lots of takes in the games because we're under a lot of budgetary pressure and we were trying to make it as fast as possible because it was such a wordy program. But there was one scene which we took ages to shoot. I reckon we must have shot it 9 or 10 times, and it was completely our fault. Gina was sitting in my office. The episode contains a member of the unions, and I said to Gina, I said as me in the program to Gina, go and see this guy, but do not make him angry. The last thing we need is a strike. We cannot afford it. The games are about to happen. Just get through it. He's a reasonable enough fellow. And I came back in after being in a different meeting, and she was sitting in my office looking somewhat guilty, and I went in and I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "The unions." And it said on the page, and I'd written this, I should have found it easy enough to do. The lines said, "What do they want?" Her line, "Better conditions." My line, "When do they want them?" Well, I reckon we took 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour to get this right because the rhythm was so funny. If you see it, if you ever see it, where I'm not looking, I couldn't not look at Gina and she could not look at me. By the time we got a person, we're not looking at each other at all. It's too funny. And it's the rhythm. So very often, you might find that, my dad was very musical, for example, something he didn't much use until he became rather elderly when he adored music. Now, I had no idea he had any instinct for music at all. But rhythm, is just crucial, as it is again in talk. Sometimes everybody will have this experience. Something's funny, it's because of the way the things happened in that order at that pace. And a lot of humour is like that.
After having spent a lifetime being a humorist and all of those labels that people kind of put onto you, is there an expectation that you enter a room and people go, "John, crack hardy, tell us a joke"? And
no, I don't think there is.
No?
No.
You don't?
No, I don't, because what I do isn't really very jocular. What I do is to do with a kind of a tone and an attitude. And actually, if we've got it right in most of the projects you've mentioned, if we've got the writing right and the performance level right, the joke is in your head. And what we're trying to do is to suggest the joke to you as subtly as possible so that we don't have to do it. It's a relatively minimalist way of doing it, but I could never remember jokes anyway. I can't remember very many jokes. Life's a joke. I mean, you don't need to remember. They're all over the place.
John, tell us about this 2.5 minute slot that's there and it's been waiting there for 27 years, and every week you've got 2 people who've done an interview. The fact that you've been able to kind of get that kind of longevity, and one would think that kind of format would just run out of steam after a while. How has it managed to keep going? What's the secret? Is it in the relationship with Bryan? Is it in the writing?
Well, the first thing about that is that, of course, the material is responsive to what's happening in the world. So it's not as if you...
Grading it out.
No, it's not as if you... it's not once upon a time and then what will I imagine next. You look at the world, it's like a cartoonist. You're looking at the world and then you're creating a version of part of it, which basically says, look at it from over here. In that case, I started writing those when I had a newspaper column, and I was encouraged to then perform them, and I met Bryan, who was a radio producer, and we started doing them in radio, and then I was asked to go initially to Channel 9, and they wanted me to do monologues, and I'd done enough monologues to last me for the rest of my life when I was younger, and I thought, well, I'd rather get the second voice in it, because if you get a second voice, you can then get a third. And, you know, I mean, if the phone rings, you've got a third, and if there's a person just say, pardon, that guy. So eventually you can sometimes do a little drama. And those possibilities are all very interesting ones, and they prevent you from having to do a monologue which has got a singleness of line to it by definition. So I proposed to Channel 9 that instead of doing monologues I do this, and Channel 9 agreed. And so we went to Channel 9 and we started doing these, and after about a month I noticed that when we recorded each episode, the Channel 9 lawyer was standing there. And I said, he was a perfectly nice fellow. And I said, as a matter of interest, why are you here every week? And he said, well, Channel 9's a very rich organisation, John, and we don't want to get sued. And there are libel laws, and I'm here to make sure that, you know, you don't get us into serious trouble. And I said, well, it's not my principal aim to be sued either, as a matter of interest. Why don't you explain to me what you're frightened of? What are the dangers? And he said, that's not a bad idea. He said, right, the one thing you must not say is that somebody is a liar. I said, would it be okay if I said something? And Bryan said, is that the truth? And I said, can you repeat the question? And he said, yes, you can say that. And I thought, well, that's good. That's a much better comic idea. Because the idea then is transferred to the audience, yes. and you don't have to. And I thought that was one of the most useful conversations. And fortunately, it happened very early. And the permutations are limitless. And there are lots of dialogues in our lives. So while we were trying to look as non-threatening as possible, so we're sort of middle-aged men in suits in conventional-looking television shots, which are a certain size. If we shot those in a different way, people would recognise them much less. And what we want is in something that's very quick. You need to relax very swiftly into what you're watching and into what the interview is about. And into its tone, whether or not Bryan's angry and attacking me, or whether or not I'm asking questions, which can sometimes be done. And what sort of dance is this? And we're also mocking the idea that middle-aged men do pretend to be running things in suits on television all the time. That's the way the world pretends to work. So then what we've got to do is to get a genuine response which rings a bell. People need to recognise what we're saying.
So the world is never going to run out of its foolishness, so you're never going to run out of material to respond to. Is that right?
I think we're not going to... There might be patterns that are repeated in the material that we're responding to, but our response... we should be able to find new ways of doing it. And there's lots of interviews. I mean, there's the standard, interview like this. There's the, if you go to the doctor says, hello, Bruno, does this hurt? What happened? That's a completely different sort of interview. We quite often do one where one of us is in serious trouble at school, which Bryan is really good at for some unknown reason. And that's a particular sort of interview because it suggests all of the things that happen in a school, and it also suggests that things are often happening at about the level of badly behaved secondary school students, which is often to aggrandise them slightly.
So you're going to be doing these for another 27 years, John? Is there enough material in the world?
I don't know, but there's enough material in the world. I don't know quite what to do.
Do you get tired of it? Is there something exhausting about watching you? It's the question.
No, I don't get tired of it. It's
energising?
Yeah, it's energising. It's a real privilege to be to do something that's reasonably tightly written and then performed in quite a relaxed way, it's short, which is good. A lot of things in the world would be better if they were shorter. Less is more. It is, yeah. And ideally, we should be making an observation or a set of observations or something where the humour of it should be ironical, so that the humour of it is in your mind when you watch. I mean, I grew up watching stuff, and that was the feeling I had when I watched the stuff, when I watched Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and things. And there were no recorders in those days. There was no videotape. So when I was like secondary school age, I would watch Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and I would watch it, and I don't think I blinked the whole episode. And there was a record button inside my head, and as soon as the program credits were finished, I could have done you the program. I was absolutely recording it, and all of the humour was in me. It was relatively deadpan. It was often extremely subtle, and I just couldn't get enough of it. I ran all the way into it. You need the audience you need them to have room to bring their intelligence and their observations to it. It's not just mine or Brian's or whatever. It's a genuine sort of collaboration, and if the people who run television ever find out about it, they could be in trouble.
Have you got the audience clearly in mind? Because I remember you saying once back in another chat we had that you said, I have a sense of being in the audience, and I think about me sitting in the audience, what it is that I'd like to be kind of happening.
Yeah, I do. It's not. Yes, I'm not conscious of it, but that is true. I'm completely instinctive writer and performer, and my instinct is that my only guide to what an audience might find amusing is what I might find amusing.
So you don't walk away after the film and go, there's no high fives between you and Brian, have a strong sense that this one's gone down well, or this is not as good as the other one, and all of that.
No.
Are you critical of your own work?
Yeah, I think there are other factors too that you can't control. Like one of my kids said one day when we were talking about putting some stuff on a DVD, she said, this was 10 years ago or something, she said, why don't you go on the internet and find out which ones get the most hits? And I said, how do you do that? She said, go and put the kettle on, I will find out. So she went into the thing and she said, there you go, now there are the 20 Clarke Daws that have had the greatest number of hits since Clarke Dawe started going up online, and you'll notice the pattern. And I said, what's the pattern? And she said, all of them are about economics or the environment. Because they're pan-national issues. You don't need to know who Joe Hockey is or who, the Treasurer is. This is about economics, structurally about economics or whatever it is, or about the environment, which is it's a pan-national issue. So an overseas audience will come to that one.
So did that influence your choices in the future to say we're going to play more in those ways?
No, my point is that it doesn't, but that it's an interesting fact. I think if you started catering the material to what worked best, you would be in danger of not developing enough. I mean, I've changed the way I write them, I've changed the way I perform them, and as I said, this is a real pleasure because it's my life and it's moving at the pace of my life. My work moves at the pace of my life. That's what's... there are things that I wouldn't have... I mean, there are things I did when I was younger that were completely sexist, for example, and I look back at them and I think, do I wish I hadn't done them? Well, no, because I wouldn't have learned if I hadn't done them. The only thing I can do is try and get better and learn and so on. So yeah, we are, critical and nothing's perfect.
Do you still wonder, after all those years of doing all those things that you do you kind of go, if I had walked into a room where I met people who had no idea who John Clarke is, that I would have trouble in one line saying, I'm John Clarke and this is what I do?
No, I asked them what they did, I think.
But you're not interested in the attention being on you?
No, I've got a healthy ego, but I don't think I require anybody to know who I am or what I do.
So to nail it, to define it, to go, I'm a teacher,
No.
I am, is not kind of...
No.
You don't need a name card that says John Clarke.
No.
Whatever. Yeah.
No, in fact, I was trying to rig up recently. My mother-in-law was in a nursing home, and my wife had been to Europe, and she'd taken some photos, and one of the people at the nursing home said, it'd be really nice if you would like to, if you could bring some of those photos and show them and tell them about the trip round. She's an art historian, so she'd been to a whole lot of galleries. And she said, oh, yeah, okay. And she said to me, you come with me, you can be the technician. And I'm not in the least bit technically minded, but I went out there and I worked out that there was a data projector in the ceiling, and I worked out how to flick through to the next slide and things, and Helen was talking, and the woman who was organising this said, oh, that's great. And I said to this woman eventually, oh, what do you do? And she said, I'm a diversionary therapist. And I said, so am I.
John Clarke.
Call it what you like.
Friendship. You've got this wonderful friendship with Bryan Dawe. How important is friendship in that kind of creative process of and liking each other and caring about each other and caring about your collective work? Because you had a great relationship with Paul Cox, the film writer, didn't you, the filmmaker, and Ross Stevenson. Collaboration and friendship. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, collaboration, I love collaboration. And a lot of things are collaborative, and my beginnings in all of this were at university where everything was collaborative. And I have a very collegiate attitude to all of that, and one of the reasons I didn't want to do monologues is that it's dark and lonely work.
Because it's a shared experience.
Yeah. But also because in collaboration, like with Paul Cox, for example, when we wrote Lonely Hearts together, he was Dutch, and the thing had no comedy in it at all before I got well, there are Dutch comedians. It's just that Paul wasn't one of them. And we started writing, and I got very, very interested in what he wanted to do with the film. And he eventually, the film has got some humour in it, and a lot of the humour in it he wrote, and a lot of the more lugubrious bits in it I wrote, because to a degree in a collaboration you become one another. It's an opportunity to lose yourself in the notions of the other. It's terrific. There's a lot of otherness in a lot of these things. There's a famous story called from the Greek of Narcissus, and Narcissus is regarded in the modern world as a story about self-love. And Oscar Wilde, who was a Greek scholar at university, won the Greek prize at Oxford, he said, this is wrong, this is a misunderstanding of the original story. It's not actually about self-love. Narcissus goes to the pool, and he looks in the pool, and he sees a reflection of himself, and he falls in love with it. It's not him, it's a reflection. It's an otherness, it's a part of himself he's never seen before. Other people might be able to see, but he's never quite. So Oscar Wilde rewrote the story, and it's in The Complete Wild. It's only about half a page, and the guts of what he did with it is that at the end, Narcissus, in the real story, Narcissus dies because he has unrequited love. That's never capable of satisfaction, and there's nothing to live for, so he died. In Oscar Wilde's rewriting of it, where he thinks you've lost the otherness, you've mistold the story, he writes that Narcissus comes to the pool for the final time and says, righto, that's it, I'm not coming here anymore. I've thought about this, it's not healthy, it's not good for me, I'm going to stop doing it. And a voice says, no, you've got to keep coming. And he says, who's that? He looks around, there's nobody there, and the voice says, it's the pool. And he says, no, I've thought about it. It's not healthy. It's sick. I'm not going to do it anymore. No, says the Bull, you must keep coming and do it every day. And Narcissus says, why? And the Bull says, because when you bend over and look into me, I can see myself reflected in your eyes. And there's an otherness in so many parts of our lives. And collaborating with someone else creatively, where you're being adventurous, requires a lot of things that collaborations in life require, and it works under the conditions where collaborations in life work, and it fails where they fail. You need to trust each other, for example. I was involved in a film that was made in Adelaide last year, where the lead was played by Anthony LaPaglia.
My cousin.
Yeah, I found out. And Anthony, I'd never met Anthony before, and he and I were playing people who work together. We work in a real estate office. And so we needed, in the film, we know each other, but we'd never met. And he was arriving from America about 2 days before we started shooting. And I thought, oh, well, this will be interesting. I don't know him, and he's a brilliant actor. He's a very experienced actor who's done 100 films. I've done about 10, 5 maybe. And I'll be completely out of my depth and stuff. I don't know how this will work. We'll give it a go. And I suddenly, Anthony had this idea, which he claims he's never had before. He's never done this before. But I started getting emails from his character to my character. So I started getting emails from a guy called Frank Mollard, who's his name in the film, and they were addressed to Philip Lang, who's my name in the film. So we had this extremely amusing email exchange, and then a fortnight later or something, we met in Adelaide. I trusted Anthony with my life by that stage. Very intelligent thing to do, because we weren't going to have time to really get to know each other. So his instinct was, let's get the characters to know each other.
That's great.
And it was terrific.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrific. But trust is a terribly important thing there, and very often, part of the rhythm in the Clarke and Dawe, for example, will very often be just Bryan going, or whatever it is, his rhythm in those things. You can always cut to him doing that. I completely trust him. I don't even look at him sometimes but there he is, he's always doing that. And you need to trust people you're writing with, because you need to get the job done. In real terms, you need to get the pig to market. Then you've got to make it the most delicious thing that you can make together. Again, it's like a lot of other aspects of life.
I haven't heard you mention, John, that you think that in your role as satirist and all the things you do, that you're contributing something kind of important to our social kind of consciousness, or you're trying to set out to change some fundamental wrongs in our society. I don't get the impression you'd be a man with that kind of hubris that would say, my work is... But is there an element of where satire is trying to go, look at the things, look at the foolishness, look at some of the things we do appallingly badly, look at some of the crazy stuff here. Are you trying to get us to do that? Are you trying to get us to look at it and change?
I wouldn't want to make any false claim for what I do, but I do think that the community is very satirical. A lot of things that we do on television emerge from a conversation I've had with someone in a gas station or something, where somebody says something to me and I think, that's very smart, And I remember when Jeff Kennett was the Premier and there was an election and Jeff Kennett was supposed to win it. All the newspapers said Jeff Kennett was going to win it. Because they all wanted him to win. And he surprisingly got beaten. And the place he got beaten was in regional Victoria. And I was in Phillip Island, and I was in a shop getting a pie or something, and I said, who's going to win the election down here? And he said, the bloke said, the independent woman. And I said, who is she? Oh, he said, I don't know, but she's going to win. I said, she's going to win. It says in all the papers in Melbourne think Kennett's going to win and the Liberals are going to win this seat. No chance, he said. I said, why not? He said, there's no bloody Sunset Boulevard in Kilcunda, mate. And I thought, I'll bet that's right. I'll bet, there's just something about the amount of local knowledge that was coming at me down this one remark. So quite often, and I think people are very, very humorous and they're very smart and they often testing out ideas in their conversation and in their playfulness with one another. And I think what we do is simply a public manifestation of that, and there should be a lot more of them. I mean, I'm astonished that there's not more of that on television.
So is there an acute...
There's a lot of comedy, but a lot of it comes, unfortunately, from a thing called a comedy department.
Is there a sense in which Dawe Clarke is walking around with his antennae kind of really sharp and picking these things?
No more so than anyone else. I think I'm just a person who needs to go and cook an omelette once a week, and of that kind, and do other things as well. And as I say, as I've got older, those other things have tended to be different other things, and other things that are largely driven by my interests.
Where's our public discourse at, John?
Terrible at the moment. I think it's in a really bad way. I think
the worst it's ever been in your lifetime?
Unquestionably. Because the decline of the newspapers has removed an entire employment base for very highly skilled researcher writers who are not interested in the Kardashians and stuff like that. They were trying to work out, what businesses were corrupt, what's the connection between the stuff of public life. And because that employment base has been removed and is keeping being removed, I mean the decline is well on its way, but it's gathering pace, then there's a great opportunity for someone else to do that, and that opportunity is not much being picked up. There are individual people doing it in their individual fields, and there are agglomerators on the net who are trying to drag those things together and have the strands, develop a portal through which you need to go for that. But I think it's still a bit of a mess, and I, for example, don't know quite where to seek authoritative, sensible and well-made arguments about the society I'm living in.
Who do you go to? Who do you read? Who are the enlightened voices that Dawe Clarke looks to go, make some sense of this, help me to have some hope about the kind of world I want to live in? Who are the people that inspire you? Well,
of course, one of the things I'm looking for is people who make completely stupid arguments really badly. And of which there's a fairly rich crop. So I'm not always looking for. I mean, I often ring someone up and say, like an economist or someone, and say, "Can you explain that to me? I don't get that. What is this business I keep reading about this? What does it mean?" I'll just ring someone who I think is an expert in that field and say, "Sorry to bother you, but can you give me 5 minutes on that?" Because I can't find it anywhere.
But where do you go to, John, when you go, the universe is a baffling, confusing, dispirited place at the moment? What brings you back from that place?
Oh, well, I don't know particularly. Some contemporary writing does. But I mostly go to older things. I reread a lot of...
Do you?
Yeah, I reread certain books.
What's your favourite reread?
Well, I read a lot of poetry because I've always liked poetry, particularly certain
That's
poets.
an unusual thing, isn't it? Wislavas and Borska said 3 out of 1,000 like poetry.
I think it's much more than that. I mean, if you say to people, a lot of people say, oh, I don't know anything about poetry, but they'll be able to recite you 10 Beatles songs. And in all sorts of ways that's not dissimilar. I don't mean I'm reading particularly arcane, metaphysical Polish poetry. I'm reading stuff that's accessible to me. And the reason that I confident in reading Seamus Heaney was that I had the good fortune to meet him when he was here in 1994. And when he talked, I understood the moment he started talking how you're supposed to read his poetry, because his voice is what writers will sometimes call their voice. In Seamus's case, is his voice, his talking voice, which was absolutely brilliant. I remember, and it's not even jocular, but there's such amusement in it, and such depth and such wisdom and everything. I remember going to a session that he was involved in at the Melbourne Writers' Festival, and it was about religious poetry. And Seamus was born in a Catholic family. He was not a huge churchgoer, and he was interpreting religion in its most broad kind of spiritual context in terms of the history of poetry. And somebody got up, rather thin-lipped at the end of the Q&A session, and said, "Can I ask Seamus Heaney how he would define religious poetry?" And Seamus said, "Religious poetry is that poetry in which the exclamatory particle O figures considerably." I thought, you are brilliant. That's just absolutely... And he did this all the time. And I knew how to read his poetry, because his poetry was like a very finely distilled version of his talk. So I read a lot of poetry. The novels I reread are mostly Irish, which is also probably genetic.
If you had to take one novel to the proverbial deserted island, John, which one would it be?
Probably The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien. But I like all sorts of other writers, and I think all sorts of other writers are like, for example, I think Dickens. I could make quite a good argument, I reckon, that Dickens is the first really great television writer, because it's episodic. It's all the things television needs writing to be. It's terribly engaging. It's dramatically solid, even if it's a little bit all over the place. It's got fantastic characters in it. It's often extremely funny. And at the end of each episode, you have to watch the next one. It's just everything that television needs. And yet, when I was at university studying Dickens, I found the novels incredibly dense, and I couldn't be bothered reading. I just went and read a primer. What do I need to know about? What does F.R. Leavis think of Dickens? Other novels are just like swimming laps in pleasure.
You watch your great friend Paul Cox through his dying phase. Is that one of the most difficult things to do as a friend, to accompany someone in their dying? And does it make you more fragile about your own kind of mortality and your own kind of how long you've got here and what you should do with that time?
No, not really. I think in Paul's case, no, I didn't think much about myself, because I'm probably in complete denial about any of that. But Paul had liver cancer, and he had a liver transplant, and he possibly could have died at that time, but he had 7 years more life, and he seized the day.
Did he?
Yeah, it was fantastic, and everybody who knew him watched it with relish and astonishment. He just decided he wasn't going to die, basically, and he had enormous willpower, and he had mounted some projects, and he got through all of them. And he knew what was happening as well. The way he dealt with it was terribly impressive, but I was very impressed with him. I didn't much think about it myself. I didn't think there were,
What was impressive about the way he dealt
Well, he said, for example, not long before he died, just in case anybody thought he was going to live forever and that he no longer had liver cancer and things, which was not the case because he did. He said to me, "I know what's happening to me. I know I'm going backwards, but I can still see the universe." And that was his way of saying that, in a sense, as his world narrowed, his perspective and his joy and delight in the world almost increased because everything was so much sharpened for him. And I found that a very interesting thing. But he was pretty interesting. He was a pretty interesting man, and the way that he saw things was. But I've known a few people who have impressed me a great deal.
And Wilcox too, just to finish there, I think in your story you quoted him, he says, "At this stage I believe in nothing and everything."
That's right.
It's a sensational thing.
He said, "I believe in nothing and everything." That was because he'd been each evening he lived in Melbourne, and each evening he went out onto his little balcony and he raised both arms in the air at 7 p.m. because there was a woman in Uzbekistan who was beaming healthy waves to him. And he was receiving them by doing this. And he said, "I know it's silly," he said, "but at this stage I believe in nothing." And he was a great enjoyer of life. Death is a permanent arrangement, and he wanted to hold it off a bit longer.
What does John Clarke believe in?
I've no idea. I mean, I watch these other people dealing so magnificently with these big issues of life and death and things, and I think I'm living in a kind of naive bubble, or I've been, so lucky that I haven't had a lot of experience of that. My parents died in their mid-90s, no, I don't think I have terribly much hearing. I don't actually have. I mean, one of the issues about the public debate that you mentioned is that there's this idea in Australia, which is a completely made-up idea of balance politically. There's the left and the right. Nobody ever defines quite what they are, some things are terribly frowned on. Stuff. And if these flag wavers weren't there, people would be very often completely confused. They wouldn't know whether a lot of people would agree with the left-wing idea, and then they get something in the mail saying, "You just agree with the left-wing idea," or "You just agree with the right-wing idea," and it interferes with people's notions of where they stand or something. But actually, in the world of ideas, we shouldn't be frightened of ideas. There should be on television, for example, it would be good if there were a program that opened a whole lot of ideas and explored them. I wish they did, because if people got less frightened, I quote something in talking about my father, who would. I remember coming into the kitchen one day, and he was sitting there with one of our daughters, and he said, "Oh, no," he said, "these feminists, good grief." And his granddaughter, my daughter, said, "Well, I'm a feminist, Ted." No, he said, "You're a beautiful young woman." and she said, "Do you know what a feminist is?" And he said, "You tell me." And she then told him he had no idea what he was talking about. He was so far out of his depth. He was just flag waving. He'd just seen the other boys doing it, and he wanted to have a go at it. He came out of it, and I said, "How did that go?" And he said, "God, that's interesting." She's very clever. He had no idea. And we all do it. I'm sure we all have an assumption, or we'll get to something for the wrong reason, and I think it's very interesting. It's very interesting. I remember doing philosophy at university and being very impressed with the fact that no one had ever said to me before in my life, before I got to university, "Let's have a look at that idea." You know, I mean, I did philosophy because I went to an open day, and the various different people from the different disciplines at the university got up and said, "Well, we hope you do geography. Geography's exciting. It's about countries and stuff." And the philosophy guy got up and said, "Well, it's a bit difficult. We hope you do philosophy, but it's a bit difficult to describe exactly what philosophy is. But I'll give you an example of a philosophical question. If you have 2 sugars in your tea and I have no sugar in my tea, does that mean you like your tea sweeter than I like my tea? Well, we like the same taste, but it takes you 2 sugars to get it." I thought, I'll study this because I thought that this is, you know, there's the university teaches humour. And its name is philosophy. It's about how you think. It's about the words, because the words are terribly... You know, words are... I live in the republic of words, I suppose. But it's because I've always wanted to. I do love the way that words can be arranged and rearranged. And rearranged. And how a response, you know, how yes can be a negative and no can be a positive, and all these other things, which are to do with ideas. And I think and instead of that, what we've got in the debate is something that shuts down the discussion of ideas and says, which group are you in? Are you appalled of Footscray? You know, or are you angry of Camberwell? You know, absolute piffle. No one cares. And it's not an actual discussion of the ideas. And we live in a society where it's reasonable to ask questions. We run the society. It's a democracy. It's reasonable to ask questions about why we're doing these things. Why, for example, if free trade is successful, why do you need a trade deal? I don't know. I mean, is it, you know, it's to do with, you know, either free trade works as free trade is said to work, or you have a trade deal which particularly favours these people, which is not free, you know. So all over the place there are questions to ask, and one of the opportunities I get once a week is to frame up one of those questions and beam a light at it in my childish way. I mean, I'm suggesting I get it right, but to have a look at it partly for my own benefit, and I think this society should be much more open and fuller of that. I find that there are intelligent people everywhere, and they're not talking to me in the public discussion.
There's 200 people coming to this beautiful room on a Wednesday, Tuesday night. Does that happen, John?
Yes, it's very nice.
No, not that they just come to pay.
I might say a lot of these people are related.
But seriously,
no, it's lovely. It's a very
going back and wanting to talk and be in a space together.
It's very
heartened.
Oh, I'm heartened by pretty well everything. I refuse to be disheartened by any of the things that I think are irritating. I don't think we should be. I don't think we should give them the satisfaction of disheartening us. And I'm heartened by almost everything. And it's lovely to see so many people here. And I think there's a great deal of community activity that's not in the media. And the media is almost a bit of a false sideshow over there. And you know, if you're on television, you know, if people don't recognise you and you're on television, you're probably in the wrong racket. Doesn't mean you're any good. You've got to be a bit careful that you don't think that, you know, you're any good. You've got to keep at it and you've got to keep learning. And, you know, but I do...
Looney said once that there were 2 groups of people, those that have a twinkle in their eye and those that don't. Do you still have a twinkle in your eye, John?
Yeah, I'm in...
You're in the twinkle category?
Well, I'm not only am I in the twinkle category, I think an awful lot of people are, and I think there are attempts to by the people who run this society at twinklectomies, and I don't think they should be allowed to get away with it.
Could you please thank the irrepressible Lydia Dawe? I love my job, John. I have the best job in this place. I get to talk to people like you, and it's glad to go
Well, it's very
go.
nice to come along here, I might say, and be asked such interesting and intelligent questions with such a lovely crowd of people.
And sincerely, this is the biggest crowd we've ever pulled in this room. To our wonderful summer community, thank you for tuning out. A few questions from the floor before we go, and we've got book bonding here from Gisborne.
Oh.
We're going to sell some of John's books too, so come and support Australian and New Zealand literature. Big loud voice.
Are politicians sitting ducks any more so than any other group of people?
Yeah, they are a little bit because of their position, but that's one of the reasons that I think it ought to be more a discussion of ideas. I would hope that our stuff, for example, is not a kind of ad hominem argument that gets too focused on the particular person. It should be a discussion about the ideas being represented by that person and how well they're doing it and why and who's paying and stuff. But I do think, yes, they are, and particularly now, when there's been a decline in the investigative journalism and everything's just dealt with at the level of sensation. I mean, I was watching television yesterday. The swearing in of a new government was on live television. For goodness sake. Are we surprised that they remember their whole names? Or what possible interest is, it's just completely to do with filling space. Dreadful.
We've got a question. Yep. Big loud voice so they can hear down the back too, if you don't mind.
You said that you were lucky in life, that you had quite a bit of luck in life. Is that because you're naturally hardened? Or?
Yeah, I think I am naturally hardened. I've enjoyed parts of my life that a lot of people mightn't have enjoyed. And I think, in a way, our job, or my job in life anyway, I wouldn't extrapolate this across a broader community perhaps, but I've always thought my job in life is to find the pluses in the position I'm in. Because I can't always control the way the universe is going, and there'll be pluses. I just need to find them, and times have, there've been periods that have been a bit bleak or something, but there are very positive things that come out of that. And even, well, to take an example, if you write something and it doesn't work, which I've often done, you think, that just doesn't work, there's just everything's the matter with that, it just completely fails, I am completely useless, I should give it away. But why doesn't it work is an interesting question, and you would not be presented with that question and the knowledge that comes from it if you'd peeled off something that worked. Sometimes you get lucky and you go, that's okay. But whatever the situation we're in, I think it's a very useful idea to find the pluses in it, even in adversity and things.
Steve, and then we'll come to you. Okay, Steve?
What's your next big project? You've done the movie recently, you've got your 2.5-minute skits, you do. What's your next big project?
Well, I never know. The way that my living works is hair-raising.
Which one?
You really don't know what's going to happen. You need, in Australia, there's an enormous arts bureaucracy, which is the size of a small nation. And if certain projects need to attract money from that whole area, it's gargantuan. And who knows what can happen in there. It's frequently, in my case, not my job to go and get them, there's a producer who might have to go. So there are all sorts of projects that might be in some part of the conveyor belt of all of that. At the moment there's a movie that I've written a first draft of. If it looked like getting its funding, I'd go back into that straight away and do a second draft and a third draft. I'm toying with the idea, I'm trying to collect some stuff for a book. There's a thing I'd like to do on radio, but there's not a lot of, I don't know if you're allowed on radio anymore, it's not much happening. Radio is a wonderful medium, and radio is a writer's medium because, not commercial radio, but it's a commercial medium because the people are talking in the gaps between the ads. But a lot of writing is required for non-commercial radio. It's an awfully good discipline, and if you ran a broadcasting organisation, I think, if you ran the ABC, you'd try a whole lot of things out on radio, and if you worked, you'd move them across to television stuff. You'd use them in conjunction rather than in competition or something. But I've always got, half-baked ideas floating around the computer and things in my head gestating at their own pace. So I don't think I have a particular big thing that's about to roll out. You never know, somebody might ask you to be involved in something that you haven't heard of until it happens, and that might be very engaging. The film I did in Adelaide, I didn't write, didn't direct, didn't produce. I just went and did it because I liked the people involved. It was going to be done quickly by terrific people. I thought I'll go and give that a go, but it doesn't work. My family won't see it. They're in New Zealand. So I never quite know. So the way that my living works is you've got to have some things over there that you know are happening and a whole lot of other things here that might happen and some other things over there that will probably never happen, but you wish they would.
I've got a question from the young lady there.
You mentioned on the way up, when you stopped at Gellibrand National Park, you saw the parloads, and it took you away from the hustle and bustle of the drive up, and I'm guessing you found some comfort and satisfaction in seeing them. Just out of interest, I think I know the answer to the question, but do you think that as a society we maybe need to step away from the rush of living, and how important is it for happiness to actually go back into nature and appreciate what's often right there in front of us? Do you think that adds to your ability to be happy, and maybe we're missing something?
Well, it does with me. I don't know how you would enact that across a society, but each of the individual molecules in society would surely benefit from it. I grew up in a world where you were in the natural world a fair bit, and we go down to Phillip Island a fair bit, and we have a house down there that's near a water bird sanctuary. And for years and years and years I used to walk up and down and around that area, but without knowing exactly what the birds were or what their lives were like, what their patterns of migration was, all of that stuff. And I started photographing them at one stage with the advent of digital photography, and I got very interested in doing it. And I partly went there today, although the light was terrible this afternoon, but I went there to see what birds they had there, and I saw about 1 million spotted pardalotes, which are a beautiful bird about the size of an ant. Gorgeous, gorgeous birds, and they're in particular eucalypts in that park. Not in the eucalypt next door, which is the wrong eucalypt for a pardalote. But I also saw flame robins and thousands of wrens, parrots, on a grey day with planes landing just, across from the parrot's head. So it was fabulous. And I am so dumb about these things that when I go and look at them, I need my whole brain to work out what I'm looking at and what they're doing and stuff. As a consequence of which, if I do it for half an hour, I feel like I've been away from everything else in my life for a suitably lengthy period that I have just thrown another 6. It's gorgeous. So I find it very refreshing and renewing. Always have.
We'll take one more question. Oh, that was such a beautiful note.